So this is part two of my lecture on how to write essays. For part two, I'm going to now turn to page 12. Page 12 of our handout on essay writing. And on page 12, you'll find the first of two sample essays. Sample essays written about Shakespeare's play Macbeth by English 100 students who took the course through the University of Saskatchewan. I'm going to first look at Melanie Masenchuk's essay on Macbeth. I want to go through it paragraph by paragraph, assessing the strengths as well as the weaknesses. So let's begin with paragraph number 1. This is her introductory paragraph. I'll read it to you now. Follow along with me. The tragedy of Macbeth is known as Shakespeare's bloodiest though shortest piece. In this story of two ambitious people who play off each other to create a literal festival of death, there is the question of how Macbeth is drawn to commit the deeds he does. Some say he simply fulfills the prophecies of the witches. Others say his wife drives him to it. We can argue that both factors come into play, as Lady Macbeth shares many common characteristics with the Weird Sisters, and often seems one of them. She is not a witch in appearance or habit, but in thought and subtle action and accomplishments, she ends up being no less than the queen of the witches. So the students in this class were asked to write an essay on Macbeth, and one of the topics they could choose from was this question of the relationship between the witches, who are also known as the Weird Sisters in this play, and Lady Macbeth, the wife of the play's main character, the title character, Macbeth. Those of you who have never read Macbeth, here's a brief overview. The play, written by Shakespeare in 1606, is about a Scottish warrior who leads the king's army into battle. And he's celebrated as a great patriot and fighter for Scotland. After a particularly brutal battle against a group of rebels, Macbeth, along with his friend Banquo, enter a forest, and in that forest they meet the three witches. The three witches who are also known as the Weird Sisters. The witches offer prophecies to Macbeth. And because of those prophecies, Macbeth begins to realize that he desperately wants to be the King of Scotland. The key prophecy from the witches is, Macbeth, thou shalt be king. And so he begins to revolve in his mind how he's going to gain the kingship. He can really only do it by usurping, by murdering the present king, his master for whom he fights his battles, King Duncan. Macbeth turns to his wife for advice, and she urges him to commit the murder. She creates a plan that they'll kill King Duncan when he's staying overnight at their castle, and they go through with it. And that basically sums up the first half of the play. In the second half of the play, Macbeth and his wife, Lady Macbeth, are challenged from without by the son of King Duncan and forces still loyal to King Duncan. The more intriguing part of this drama is the opposition that the couple faces from within. Both end up being tormented by their consciences. So that's the play Macbeth. And Melanie is addressing this question of how similar is Lady Macbeth to these characters, the witches. So let's just go through this introduction sentence by sentence. I like the opening. The opening tells us what she's going to be discussing. She's going to be discussing the tragedy of Macbeth. From that opening sentence, Melanie moves into the interpretive issues. This question that arises for readers of the play, for viewers of the play: why does Macbeth do the things he does? Is it because of the witches? Is it because of his wife urging him on? Melanie, in the final two sentences of her introductory paragraph, offers her point of view, picking it up middle of the paragraph. We can argue that both factors come into play. I've stressed in other classes that it's a bad idea to use the first person singular pronoun I, or me, or my. We, however, the plural pronoun, often works. I think it works well in this opening paragraph. We can argue that both factors come into play, as Lady Macbeth shares many common characteristics with the Weird Sisters, and often seems one of them. And now here comes the thesis statement of the essay that lays out in a single sentence the main argument that Melanie will go on in the middle paragraphs to outline. She is not a witch in appearance or habit, but in thought and subtle action and accomplishments, she ends up being no less than the Queen of Witches. I think this is a very strong thesis statement. In the thesis statement, Melanie makes clear what her main argument is, that Lady Macbeth is not only similar to the witches, she herself could be considered the Queen of the Witches. And notice that in this thesis statement, Melanie explains why the argument is valid. In other words, she gives us a preview of how she's going to prove the thesis true. How is it that Lady Macbeth is like the witches, and indeed the Queen of the Witches? In her thought and subtle action and accomplishments. I think another strength of this particular sentence is how it climaxes, how it ends on these key words, the Queen of the Witches. So Melanie places emphasis on her main point by ending the sentence the way she does. So let's move on to the first middle paragraph, paragraph number 2. The witch's prophecy reinforces Macbeth's urge to kill King Duncan, and where the sisters leave off, Lady Macbeth picks up the task, literally driving Macbeth to murder. There's the topic sentence. The paragraph continues. The sisters foresee the deed, and their queen ensures its performance. According to Elizabethan belief, Elizabethan refers to the Elizabethan period. This was the period in English history when Queen Elizabeth I reigned and when Shakespeare wrote the majority of his plays. According to Elizabethan belief, witches caused bad weather, tidal waves, and general misfortune. They also had a hand in apparitions, nightmares, and hallucinations. So when Macbeth's dreams about Duncan's murder and hallucinations of the dagger could be attributed to the sisters' prophecies, they could also be caused by Lady Macbeth herself. She goaded him into killing Duncan, challenging his manhood, and their shared guilt of the crime affected Macbeth more than the witches' words. The weirds, that is the witches, were fate personified, and Lady Macbeth manifested this. Very nice word, manifested. Lady Macbeth manifested this, pushing her husband to the outcome they both wanted. In the end, however, Lady Macbeth lost control of her husband and became, as the other witches, simply an observer. In committing murder, Macbeth does not blame the witches for pushing him to the crime. That spur was supplied by his wife. But he does think they deceived him with false promises. Lady Macbeth, too, dwelled on the joys they would have once Macbeth's kingship was realized, protecting him from the consequences. So I think a very good paragraph in how Melanie starts it. A great topic sentence that points out a similarity between Lady Macbeth and the witches. They all urge Macbeth to commit this horrible murder, and they all end up observers of his subsequent evil actions. So Lady Macbeth and the witches are similar in that they share a similar plot function. I also like the ending. There's that nice transition in the final sentence. Melanie has talked about the witches, and then she moves on to Lady Macbeth. And that one word is so useful here. To Lady Macbeth, too dwelled on the joys they would have once Macbeth's kinship was realized. Now, there's one major weakness of the first middle paragraph, paragraph number 2, and that is it doesn't have any quotations. As I said in the first half of the lecture, it's so important to back up your assertions, your arguments about the text you're studying by using direct quotations from that text. In this case, she needs to be quoting from the play Macbeth in every one of the middle paragraphs. Well, let's see how she does in paragraph number 3, the second middle paragraph. It begins, "The sisters were thought of as the Fates, as devil's associates, or even as devils dressed as women. At any rate, it can be assumed that they represented something supernatural and evil. An Elizabethan audience would have readily agreed that these were forms representing Satan, who was seeking for Macbeth to fulfill his prophecies by offering temptation. Lady Macbeth, too, provided these same temptations. One of the more striking moments of the play is when Lady Macbeth crosses into the supernatural realm with her plea to the spirits. Quotation, 'Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thought, unsex me here, and fill me from the crown to the toe, top full of direst cruelty.' Direst means extremely evil. It can be argued that with this cry, Lady Macbeth is deliberately choosing evil over good and possessing herself with the spirits she has invoked. So the body of this paragraph, I think, is excellent. It's excellent in how she uses quotations. She uses a quotation to support her main point. And notice she does an excellent job introducing the quotation, that is contextualizing it, making clear to the reader who is uttering this statement, when it occurs in the play. And after presenting the quotation, she explains it. She interprets it. It can be argued that with this cry, etc. Now, there's one major weakness in this paragraph as well. Yes, there are quotations. However, the topic sentence is very weak. The sisters were thought of as the Fates, as devil's associates, even as devils dressed as women. That is not what this paragraph is about. Remember, the topic sentence, the first sentence of the paragraph, needs to sum up the entirety of the paragraph. You need to think of the topic sentence as, in its own way, a mini thesis statement that relates directly back to the thesis statement of the overall essay. And if you can do that in each and every paragraph, you will have a unified essay that will receive a high mark. Unfortunately, in this paragraph, we have a very weak topic sentence. It isn't a sentence that sums up the content of the essay, of the paragraph. Really, this paragraph is saying that Lady Macbeth and the witches are all connected to the supernatural and to Satan. And that's what Melanie should have said in the topic sentence of the paragraph. Well, let's turn then to the next paragraph. This is paragraph number 4. It's on the second page. And it reads as follows. The imagery of blood pervades the play. That's a very nice verb, pervades. It means spread throughout. The imagery of blood pervades the play. But Lady Macbeth and the sisters are especially caught up in it. Before the first meeting with Macbeth, one sister returns from killing swine. Later, they make a potion of blood for Macbeth to drink, then show him bloody apparitions. Apparitions, another word for ghosts and visions. Lady Macbeth aids in killing Duncan, and her hands end up the same color as her husband's. Quotation, but I shame to wear a heart so white. Lady Macbeth gradually becomes obsessed with the image of blood on her hands, and the blood she thought would be so easily disposed of. So the topic sentence here is a superb one because it expresses in a single sentence what this paragraph is all about. That Lady Macbeth and the witches are united in blood. And we also have a very good choice of quotations, as well as other examples from the text that relate to the imagery of blood that's connected with all of these characters. One problem in paragraph number 4, in introducing the quotation, she needed to use a colon before the quotation and not a comma. By using a comma, she created a comma splice. Remember, when you have a full sentence introducing the quotation, that is a clause with a subject and predicate, you need to place between your introductory sentence and your quotation a colon. So a colon after the word husbands and before the quotation, but I shame. Well, moving on to paragraph number 5. Perhaps the most striking resemblance between the witches and Lady Macbeth is their masculinity. Upon encountering the sisters, Banquo states, Banquo of course is the best friend, later enemy of Macbeth. Quotation, "You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so." The lack of femininity of the old hags is not unusual, as witches are often sexless. But it is odd in Macbeth's wife. Yet there are many indications where others see Lady Macbeth as not quite a lady. Her call to the heavens to unsex her is the first indication that she becomes more like a man than a woman. And she later challenges her husband's manhood. It seems not quite as stable as her own. Some submit that Lady Macbeth's words of "Know how tender 'tis to love the babe that milks me" are proof of her femininity, that she has suckled children, but the following description of dashing its brains out simply because of going back on one's word seem to make the case for her hardness. Her husband then tells her she should have only male children because her temperament is too harsh for anything else. Lady Macbeth rarely shows gentleness or compassion, and her acts are more unnatural than natural. Her cruelty is brought about from her calling the spirits. In this way, Lady Macbeth closely resembles the sisters, who may appear to be remotely female, but are not. Lady Macbeth appears to be a woman, but does not have the inner qualities. So I think that's a very successful paragraph. The topic sentence makes clear what this paragraph is about. Another similarity between the witches and Lady Macbeth. They are all female, but they all demonstrate masculine traits. Some very good use of quotations, and finally, a strong finish to this paragraph because it reiterates the point of the paragraph, the piece in the argument that Melanie is proving over the course of the essay. Well, going on to paragraph number 6. The final similarity between Lady Macbeth and the witches is how all of them speak in oxymorons and paradoxes. The sisters introduced the play with, "When the battle's lost and won, fair is foul and foul is fair," example of paradox. When they encounter Banquo, they continue with, "Lesser than Macbeth and greater, not so happy, yet much happier. Thou shalt get kings," meaning beget kings, you'll be the father of kings, "though thou be none." Lady Macbeth also, nice transition, also finds herself saying things like, "All our service, in every point twice done, then double done," meaning one thing and saying another. So a good explanation of the quotation. She just doesn't let it sit there assuming the reader will be able to understand those lines. She explains those lines. Turning over to the next page. She then states, "That which hath made them drunk hath made me bold. The night the murder was committed, nature was reversed." And here, because it's a quotation of more than 4 lines, Melanie indents it, creates an indented quotation, sometimes referred to as a block quotation. And it's one of my favorite passages from the play. "A falcon, towering in her pride of place, was by a mousing owl hawked at and killed, and Duncan's horses, a thing most strange and certain, beauteous and swift, the minions of their race, turned wild in nature, broke their stalls, flung out, contending against obedience as they would make war with mankind. And now, in the final sentence of this paragraph, Melanie not only comments on the quotation she just presented, but brings things to a close, drives home the main point of the paragraph. She writes, "This brings the thoughts and even speech of Lady Macbeth closer to that of the Weird Sisters." So again, an excellent paragraph, and it all starts with the topic sentence. The similarity between Lady Macbeth and the witches is how all of them speak in oxymorons and paradoxes. There's plenty of quotations here to prove that point. She had to carefully read the text to find the examples of paradoxes, to find the examples of oxymorons. Now, quotations are so important because, as I said in the first half of the lecture, quotations add precision to your argument. Quotations from the text are the evidence that you present to make your case. Now, there's another reason why quotations are important in reading, writing, and English essays. They show me, the person evaluating your work, that you closely read the book, right? And Melanie makes that clear. She went to the various passages that have examples of paradoxes, examples of oxymorons, and she incorporated those lines in this very well-crafted paragraph. Well, let's go then to paragraph number 7. Witches are associated with darkness and evil, and we have already seen Lady Macbeth's inherent evil. She uses night to cover up her sins, but ends up fearing the same darkness, sleepwalking and dreaming. We only see the witches in storms or the dead of night, and can imagine Lady Macbeth's presence as predominantly black. In the first act, she calls upon the thick night to, here's a quotation, "Pall thee in the dunnest smoke of hell, that my keen knife see not the wound it makes, nor heaven peep through the blanket of the dark." She wants to commit this deed, murdering King Duncan, without, heaven looking on the act, so that she will escape damnation. And here's Melanie's summing up of this quotation, ending the paragraph, where once she welcomed the night, she now sleeps with a candle at her side, and the darkness of her crimes haunt her. So another well-structured, unified paragraph. This one pointing out how Lady Macbeth and the witches are all associated with darkness and evil. And notice too, the very last sentence of this paragraph comments on and describes where Lady Macbeth ends up in the final act of this play, the conclusion of this play. And it's always a good idea to discuss the end of the novel, end of the play, end of the short story or poem near the end of your essay. You want to more or less follow the chronology of the story, if it's at all possible, when you're writing a literary essay. Well, that takes us to the conclusion, and I think it's a first-rate conclusion that demonstrates all of the qualities that Sheridan Baker writes about in The Practical Stylist. Lady Macbeth thinks like the Weird Sisters in goading her husband into becoming a murderer. She speaks in paradoxes and conflicting ideas. She is as evil and unnatural as the witches, favoring darkness and night as they do. Her obsession with blood is not unlike theirs, and her decidedly masculine traits in a woman's body link her with these hags. But she is much more powerful than the sisters. She is the queen of the witches. So it's a brilliantly crafted concluding paragraph. She goes over all of her points. Why Lady Macbeth is like the witches. They tempt Macbeth. They speak in paradoxes. They're associated with darkness and night. They're all unnatural and evil. They're associated with blood. They are female characters who demonstrate masculine traits. So she reviews all the points of the middle paragraphs before coming to her closer. And it's a very powerful closer because in just a short sentence, she reiterates her main point. The point that through presenting evidence from the text in the middle paragraphs, she has proven Lady Macbeth is the queen of the witches. It could not be any clearer what her main argument is. She never loses sight of that argument over the course of these 8 paragraphs. And that makes for a very well-structured essay. Okay, well, let's then turn to the second essay. And the second essay, written by Susan Peterson, a former University of Saskatchewan student, is also on Macbeth and tackles this topic of the similarities between Lady Macbeth and the witches. Let's look at the opening paragraph. Lady Macbeth is often labeled the Queen of the Witches. Throughout Macbeth, she identifies herself with the Weird Sisters and seems to adopt their malevolent ways in order to satisfy her driving ambition. Malevolent simply means evil. So in the first 2 sentences of this paragraph, this opening paragraph to Susan's essay, she gives the reasons why Lady Macbeth might be considered the Queen of the Witches. After this very concise and clear opening, Lady Macbeth is often labeled the Queen of the Witches. She tells us in this first sentence what the essay is going to be about. Notice, though, in sentence number 3, Susan moves into her own argument. In those first 2 sentences, she said, well, this is what other people think, including Melanie in the last essay we looked at. And in the remainder of the introductory paragraph, she explains what she thinks about this play, and in particular about this character, Lady Macbeth. And the transition is made through this transitional word, however. However, middle of the first paragraph. However, as the play progresses, it becomes clear she cannot casually dismiss her wicked deeds, nor deal with their moral consequences. Thus, Lady Macbeth's apparent unadulterated depravity. Unadulterated simply means pure. Depravity is extreme evil. Her apparent unadulterated depravity is an equivocation. Equivocation means to use ambiguous or uncertain language to conceal the truth, to avoid fully committing yourself. And it's a word that comes up throughout this play, Shakespeare's Macbeth. The witches use this word, and Macbeth himself uses the word. And now Susan is incorporating that word in her thesis statement. Lady Macbeth's apparent unadulterated depravity is an equivocation. She embraces evil not simply as the quickest path to her ambitious ends, but also in an attempt to quell, to reduce the innate guilt arising from her tortured conscience. So there is Susan's thesis statement, and I think it's a very good one. She offers her take on the character, her argument, and she indicates in her thesis statement how she's going to explain, support that argument, how she's going to prove it. I like this argument because it doesn't oversimplify the character of Lady Macbeth. You never want to do that when you're studying the great works of literature. You don't want to present a simplistic analysis that ignores the complexity of the book, of the play, of the poem. And certainly Susan's thesis does not do that. It is a very interesting thesis. The notion that Lady Macbeth wants to be evil, wants to be as evil as the witches, but never quite achieves that for reasons that Susan is going to explain in the middle paragraphs. Well, let's get to the first middle paragraph, paragraph 2 in this essay. Lady Macbeth consciously allies herself with the witches the moment she steps on stage. Fully aware of what she is doing, she summons up the forces of evil to help her accomplish the deed. She feels it is necessary to embrace the illness and asks to be filled from the crown to the toe top full of direst cruelty. She thinks if she can become evil, she will then be able to act without hesitation and feel no disturbing guilt or regret. She entreats, in other words, she asks the spirits to remove all her kind, nurturing qualities and replace them with practical filled with the milk of human kindness. Rather, she asks for her milk to be replaced with gall. Gall is something bitter, something severe, bile. She asks for her milk to be replaced with gall, sacrificing innocence for knowledge of evil. So I think an excellent paragraph here because she is developing her thesis further in this first of the middle paragraphs. She's pointing out that, yes, Lady Macbeth does want to be as evil as the witches. And Susan also does a very good job of using quotations. She pulls out key words, the illness, the deed, words that are repeated throughout the play Macbeth. Well, then we get to paragraph number 3. And I think the topic sentence is among the best that we've looked at so far. This bravado means braggadocio, this bragging, however, cannot hide Lady Macbeth's yearning for the sleep and innocence she scorned before. Now, you don't need the comma after sleep. You don't need the comma after innocence. Still a good topic sentence, in part because of the very well-placed transition, the word however. Well, let's hear what she has to say in the body of this paragraph now that we've gone over the topic sentence. Here it is. She tells Macbeth he lacks the sleep which will knit up the raveled sleep of care, or rather the virtue to smooth over their guilt. So she presents this quotation and then she explains what it means. She is troubled by thick coming fancies. In parentheses, Susan suggests that line might mean the dunnest smoke of hell. Thick coming fancies that keep her from rest. As the sleepwalking scene dramatically demonstrates, her evil persona simply unmasks the appalled conscience behind. The doctor says, seeing her enter, this is her very guise, but also that she is upon my life fast asleep. Near the end of the play, Lady Macbeth begins to sleepwalk. Although she appears completely engulfed in sin, she is in reality an innocent. Her seeming disregard for innocence is deceiving as well. She admits she could not kill Duncan while he slept. The knowledge of evil she before embraced now haunts her. She desperately wants to forget what she has done, but finds she cannot. When Macbeth sees Banquo's ghost at the dinner party, and those of you who know the play no doubt remember this scene. Macbeth has his friend Banquo killed along with Banquo's son Fleance, though Fleance manages to escape the murderers. Well, following this scene, Macbeth is having dinner with his friends and the fellow nobles of Scotland. And who comes walking on the stage? The ghost of Banquo, who only Macbeth and the audience can see. Well, this is Lady Macbeth's response to Macbeth's exasperation at the sight of the ghost. When Macbeth sees Banquo's ghost at the dinner party, his horror reminds her yet again of her own. She says it spoils the custom of the time. When she realizes Macbeth is resolved to murder Banquo and Fleance, she first tries to dissuade him, knowing that blood will have blood. You must leave this, she insists. When cold-hearted callousness, she says. So there we see a problem with the proofreading right at the bottom of this page. When cold-hearted callousness, period, no doubt Susan meant to write with cold-hearted callousness, comma. And this is the result of not enough proofreading. As I've suggested time and time again, it's so important to leave time for editing, revision, and proofreading. And one of the best proofreading strategies is to read your work aloud. And I think if Susan had spent maybe another half hour, even less, on proofreading, editing this assignment, she would have caught that mistake and fixed it because she is a very good writer. Well, turning over the page, here's the quotation that supports what Susan is saying about Lady Macbeth. Unsex me here, stop the access and passage to remorse. Remorse meaning guilt. No compunctious visitings of nature shake my fell purpose, my determined course, nor keep peace between the effect and it, my intention and my chances of making my goals a reality. Once rid of these troublesome visitings of nature, she thinks she could even dash her nursing baby's brains out. She shorn to do so. There is another problem with proofreading. I'm not entirely sure what Susan meant in that phrase. However, despite these cold words, Lady Macbeth is not totally successful in stripping herself of her nurturing qualities. Although she swears to kill King Duncan, she confesses she was not personally able to do it because he resembled her father. This relative sentimentality would not be found in a completely blackened heart. So, aside from the proofreading problems, and the proofreading problems are serious because it leads to a lack of clarity, this is a strong paragraph. It clearly backs up the point that Susan makes in her topic sentence. And she goes back to that point in the very last sentence of the paragraph. This relative sentimentality would not be found in a completely blackened heart. Supporting the overall thesis of this paper, which is that as much as Lady Macbeth aspires to be evil, tries to be evil, she is ultimately not as evil as the witches. She is not the queen of the witches. Well, moving on to paragraph number 4. Lady Macbeth also, nice transition, also attempts to reject innocence and purity, dismissing them as obstacles between her and the crown. Innocence is equated with sleep throughout Macbeth. Her outward contempt for this innocence is shown by her her description of the groom's swinish sleep. The groom is one of the guards who is supposed to be protecting Duncan, and she gives him a drink that puts him to sleep so they can carry out the murder. And her observation that Macbeth is brain sickly, to think he murdered sleep when he murdered the king. She does not feel she should be disturbed by, nor feel any mercy for, innocence. She says the sleeping are but as pictures, and who but a child fears a painted devil. She tells the remorseful Macbeth she would shame to wear a heart so white. This fails, she tries to protect herself from knowing by feigning, by pretending ignorance of what's to be done. Excellent, excellent use of quotations in this paragraph. This paragraph about how Lady Macbeth tries to reject innocence and purity, but still, in failing to do so, demonstrates, in a way, her underlying humanity. Now, you probably caught the one problem with this paragraph. Again, as a result of not enough proofreading, Susan left out the word when. You need a period after the citation for shame to wear a heart so white, a period after the parentheses. You need to start a new sentence with when this fails. When this fails, comma. She tries to protect herself. Again, if Susan had given herself a little bit more time in the proofreading, I'm sure she would have caught that mistake. Well, going on to paragraph number 5. Lady Macbeth attempts to prove on numerous occasions she is not afraid of the powers of darkness she is summoned. She calls for the murdering ministers and thick night to pall thee in the dunnest smoke of hell, and only seems to brood her husband does not possess the murderous instincts necessary to join her wholeheartedly. Again, an error here on the word brood. Susan mistakenly assumed that the word brood is a synonym for regret. Regret was the word she wanted to use. And it's certainly the case that we need to work with the dictionary by our side. And if you ever have any doubt about a word that you're using in an essay, you need to look it up in the dictionary. And if you feel as though you've used a given word too many times, That's when you go to thesaurus.com and type in that word, and you'll find synonyms for that word that you can use in the remainder of the essay. Well, continuing on in paragraph number 5, good is often compared to light in the play, as is evil to darkness. She casually dismisses their fall from righteousness, saying, once they kill Duncan, never shall sun that morrow see. She feels their wicked deeds will be worthwhile when they have achieved their solely sovereign sway and masterdom. Although they have attained the crown in a questionable manner, she does not think it will bother her black heart. Once she is filled with iniquity, again, iniquity is another word for evil, she thinks she can then easily brush aside sin as inconsequential without guilt. She says, a little water clears us of the deed. How easy it is then. So her words suggest that she is totally evil. She would like to believe that she's evil. That's the point that Susan is making in this paragraph. And I think she makes that point very well. Exploring, examining, through quotations and other examples, how Lady Macbeth has this relationship to the powers of darkness. Her attempts to show that she's fearless. Well, that leads into the second last paragraph, paragraph 6 of this essay, and I think it's by far the best of the paragraphs that make up this particular essay. And it begins with this transitional word, however. However, Lady Macbeth soon realizes she is, in fact, horribly frightened of the evil she has summoned and what it has caused her to do. She now wishes light by her constantly to dispel the blanket of the dark. She asks her husband to be bright among his guests, foreseeing his plans for Banquo and Fleance. She also realizes she has been deceiving herself by thinking all their problems can be solved with the golden round. The golden round is the crown of Scotland, that her husband Macbeth, after he murders the king, wears on his head. She's thinking all their problems can be resolved with the golden round, and in reality, they have accomplished nothing with the murder. She mourns, quotation, naught's had, naught is another word for nothing. Nothing's had, all's spent, where out desire has got without content. So they achieved everything they thought they wanted, but they are discontent. They are torn apart by the guilt over what they have done. And Susan sums it up very well here, going into excellent detail. She has sacrificed her honor, her morals, her virtue, and is still not a true queen. Finally, she cannot, in truth, flippantly dismiss her sins, nor deal with the guilt accompanying them. Her dreams are obsessed with removing the damaged spot of blood from her hands. This is a very important line in the play Macbeth. Once Lady Macbeth is consumed by guilt, she continually washes her hands, imagining that there's still literal blood on those hands, the damaged spot. Her dreams are obsessed with removing the damaged spot of blood from her hands and the memory of murder from her conscience. She knows, however, all the perfumes of Arabia cannot sweeten her memory, nor all great Neptune's oceans clear her of this deed. The reference to the perfumes of Arabia and Neptune's oceans come from the play Macbeth itself. Earlier in the play, her husband, Macbeth, uses these images to describe his own guilt. And so Susan has very cleverly paraphrased that line and now applied it to this character, Lady Macbeth. Again, demonstrating how carefully she's read the play. To write an essay like this, you need to have read the core text at least twice. Finally, the conclusion of Susan's essay, and I think it's an excellent conclusion. Lady Macbeth has lost to guilt and despair because of her inability to embrace the witch's evil completely. So Susan reiterates, restates her thesis in a very precise manner without repeating herself word for word. Remember, you want to avoid that. in the closing paragraph. Do not repeat yourself word for word. That is, do not reuse the very same words you used in the introduction to describe your argument. She continues in the conclusion. Her conscience will not allow the evil to deaden her guilt, but instead multiplies it 1,000-fold. It is thus this equivocation which brings about Lady Macbeth's downfall. Even her serpent-like actions cannot hide her longing to return to the flower's innocence. So Susan restates the thesis, then she summarizes the main points that she has gone over and supported in the middle paragraphs of this essay, and then she wraps it all up with this wonderfully eloquent sentence, I think, that really takes us back to the beginning of the play, of the essay, and recalls her thesis statement. Her thesis statement being that Lady Macbeth, in the end, is not the Queen of the Witches because she cannot entirely rid herself of her sense of right and wrong, of her sense of the innocence she has given up, of the guilt that eventually destroys her. So I think this is another very strong essay. Its strengths are that in the middle paragraphs, Susan uses quotations very effectively. She backs up what she has to say about every aspect of Lady Macbeth that she brings to our attention in those paragraphs. The topic sentences are very good, as is the thesis statement. The major weakness of this essay, more proofreading was necessary. Let that be a lesson to us all. Proofread, edit. Always leave time for that third and important stage of the writing process. Now, one final point about these two essays. When I reproduced them in our syllabus, I made them single-spaced to save space. Of course, all the essays that you submit in your courses need to be double-spaced. So I hope that you revisit these essays as you work on your assignments, because though they have their imperfections, they are very good guides, very effective guides to how to structure essays properly. So that wraps up my lecture on how to write essays.